Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get started with today's program. Welcome to the Getty Villa. I'm Sarah Cole. I'm an assistant curator of antiquities here at the Villa, and I'm also the curator of our current special exhibition, to which today's program is related, Nubia, Jewels of Ancient Sudan from the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Before we begin today's program, I'd like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. Getty recognizes and is committed to undertaking the work to build relationships with these communities. Nubia, Jewels of Ancient Sudan, is on view here at the Villa on the second floor of the museum through April 3rd of 2023. This exhibition features items of jewelry and personal adornment worn by royalty and aristocrats in ancient Nubia's kingdom of Kush. And on the map in this photo, you can see that Nubia is a region that covered part of what is today southern Egypt and northern Sudan. All of the objects in this exhibition were excavated in the early 20th century by the joint Harvard-Boston Museum of Fine Arts expedition to Sudan, and they were primarily found in wealthy tombs. As a result of these excavations, the MFA Boston has the largest and most significant collection of Nubian material outside of Sudan, and we're very grateful to them for lending us the extraordinary pieces in this exhibition. The exhibition itself covers approximately 3,000 years of ancient history, beginning with the rise of the Kingdom of Kush at the city of Kerma in present-day Sudan around 2400 BC. Jewelry from Kerma reflects the use of organic materials like shell and ivory, and the development of faience production in Nubia, which is a bright blue glazed ceramic material, as well as the skilled craftsmanship used to work with materials like gold, quartz, and semi-precious stones like cornelian and amethyst. This earlier period came to an end around 1500 BC when Egypt invaded and seized control of Nubia. And then several hundred years later, when the Egyptians withdrew from Nubia, the Kingdom of Kush reasserted itself, this time at a new capital city called Napata, around 750 BC. And it was during this period that the Nubians invaded Egypt and ruled both Egypt and Nubia together for a period of about 80 years as Egypt's 25th dynasty. After being driven out of Egypt, the kings of Napata continued to rule the Kingdom of Kush. And during this time, we see an influx of Egyptian influences in the jewelry and the self-presentation of Nubian royalty. Many exquisite items of personal adornment were created in the Napatan period, and most of the objects in this section of the exhibition come from the tombs of kings and queens. And in the later phases of the Napatan period, the administrative center of the Kingdom of Kush began to move further south to a city called Meroe. By around 350 BC, the royal cemetery had moved there as well, beginning what we call the Meroitic period. And this period corresponded with the conquests of Alexander the Great in the Eastern Mediterranean, which included conquering Egypt, and then the rise of the Roman Empire. During this time, the Kingdom of Kush maintained its independence, but had connections to Greco-Roman trade networks, and so at this time we do see some Greek and Roman influences coming into Nubian jewelry, but it still has a very distinctive local character. At Meroe, the artists were exceptionally skilled at gold working techniques, and they also employed many enameling techniques where they used powdered glass applied to the surfaces of items of jewelry to create colorful patterns. And this period came to an end around AD 350, which is where the exhibition concludes. And so now on to today's talk. Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. Goeff Emberling, who is an associate research scientist at the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. He currently directs archaeological research at a site called Jebel Barkal in northern Sudan, which he will speak about today. Dr. Emberling's research interests include comparative perspectives on ancient cities, states, empires, and ethnicity, with a particular focus on ancient cultures across the Middle East and North Africa. He received his BA in anthropology from Harvard University and a PhD in anthropology and Near Eastern studies from the University of Michigan, with a dissertation on ethnicity in early Mesopotamia. Jebel Barkal, an ancient temple center near the city of Napata in present-day Sudan, was a site of tremendous significance for ancient Nubia's Kingdom of Kush. It was believed to be the dwelling place of the supreme Nubian god Amun, and several objects in our exhibition were discovered in the vicinity of Jebel Barkal. But there was much more to the site than the royal tombs and temples that yielded the jewelry that's on display in our galleries. And Dr. Emberling's talk today is on discovering a lost Nubian city, Archaeology of Jebel Barkal, Sudan. So please welcome Dr. Emberling.
Thanks for that nice introduction, Sarah. I want to take this moment to thank the Getty for highlighting Nubia in its exhibit, which all of you should see if you haven't already. And also I would like to thank them for the invitation to speak about some of the broader context in which the pieces in the exhibition would have been made and used in ancient times. And thanks to all of you here in the room and online for joining us to celebrate ancient Nubia today. I want to begin with a kind of archaeological riddle that relates to a lost city. If nobody's looking for it, is it really lost? Think about that. And while you're thinking about that, I want to present a talk in 4 parts. First, I'll review the history of Nubia. I'll go over some of the same points that Sarah mentioned with some different emphasis, but I want to make sure that we're all in the same time and place. Second, I'll talk a little bit about the archaeological exploration of Nubia, not all the details, but enough for you to understand how archaeologists could lose an entire capital city. Third, I'll talk about the site of Jebel Barkal and what earlier excavations of temples, palaces, and pyramids at the site have uncovered. Part of the site is pictured here with royal pyramid burials to the left, the Jebel, or mountain, in the center of the image, and the sandy plains stretching down to the Nile on the right side. Finally, I'll tell you about our new project at the site, in which we've located a big part of the city that nobody had been looking for. As a last note of introduction, let me address the potential awkwardness for some of you that I'm a white American guy outlining the history of this powerful ancient African empire. This is potentially a long conversation, an important one, and I'd be happy to return to it in questions if anyone's interested. But let me just say that our archaeological field project recognizes the colonial past of our discipline and has made significant strides toward being fully collaborative, both with our Sudanese professional colleagues and with the local communities in Sudan with whom we live and work. And we are all working toward a time in which it would be at least as likely that one of them would be standing up here giving this talk as it is that I'm standing here talking to you today. So, with all that said, with all that said, let me begin in earnest by addressing the name of this ancient culture. The region I'll be talking about today is widely known to American and European audiences as Nubia. It traditionally is considered to extend along the Nile River from Aswan in southern Egypt, which you can see there, to somewhere around Khartoum in northern Sudan. It was the southern neighbor of ancient Egypt. However, the name that the ancient empire I'll be discussing used for itself was Kush, and that's the term that I will prefer to use throughout this talk. There were a number of other cultural groups living in the region, both in the Nile Valley and in the surrounding deserts. And it remains sometimes useful to have a broad designation for the entire region, and that's the context in which I and many of my colleagues, including Sarah, now use the term Nubia. So today, much of what's now ancient Kush, which you can see outlined on the map, is basically in the band of the Sahara Desert. But in antiquity, the edge of the desert was much further north than it is today. And to the south of the desert is a savanna environment that supported lions, giraffes, baboons, elephants, ostriches, and other wild animals. Kush, throughout its history, was rich in mineral resources that included gold, carnelian, and iron ore, and it was also well positioned to profit from trading goods from inner Africa to Egypt, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. So now to the historical stages of Kush itself. The term Kush first appears in the historical record in Egyptian texts around 2000 BCE, when its capital city was at a place called Kerma, which you can see in a model that's in the museum at the site today. The city was walled, and it was built around a temple complex known today as the Dufufa, which interestingly is generally thought to be an artificial mountain built of mud brick that allowed the Kushites to express their native idea that gods resided in the earth, in the rock. And so in this artificial mountain built of mud brick in the center of the city of Kerma are excavated, dug, built shrines in the mountain itself. And we'll see an echo of that at Jebel Barkal. A massive cemetery to the east of the city contained about 40,000 burials over a period of about 1,000 years. This photo to the right shows a traditional Kushite burial form, which is just a pit in the earth with a mound of earth and stones built over it. Many of these burials also show remains of funerary offerings and feasts outside the burials that clearly show cattle were highly valued. You can see the cattle skulls laid there as offerings outside the tomb. Kush was very definitely a part of the broader African cattle complex in which cattle were important economically but also symbolically in a number of ways. The largest and latest burials in the cemetery were those of powerful kings of Kush, whose burial mounds reached close to 100 meters in diameter and contained hundreds of sacrificial human burials. Kerma, by this point, had become a military threat to Egypt, raiding deep into Egypt and bringing back loot, including statues of Egyptian nobles, including this spectacular statue that had been made by that point about 400 years earlier. And it was brought back to Kerma and deposited in one of the royal burials. Soon after those raids, Egypt organized its armies and conquered Kush for what would be an occupation, a colonial occupation of over 400 years during what we call the New Kingdom of Egypt. During this occupation, Egypt extracted annual tribute from Kush and its Kush. And this is depicted in a number of tomb paintings of Egyptian officials at the time, among them the tomb of Hui here, which shows a tribute being brought in gold. You can see the little gold donuts in various places in the at the ends of the rows of people there. You can possibly also spot giraffes, cattle, and for this one I'm probably going to have to point out enslaved people in the top register at the left here. This is not really working, but these people on the left of the top register clearly have their hands bound in front of them, and so they're being brought as part of this annual tribute to Egypt. So this is to emphasize the fact that for Kush, these 400 years were indeed what we think of as a colonial occupation, unwelcome and traumatic in a variety of different ways. During this period, the southernmost outpost of the Egyptian empire was at Jebel Barkal, which you can see on the map in the center there, where the Egyptians built a fortified town that was once called Slaughter of the Foreigners. That was literally its ancient Egyptian name, Slaughter of the Foreigners, but more usually known as Napata. The Egyptians built a temple there to a local form of their chief god, Amun, where the Egyptian Amun was human-headed. Amun of Napata was always depicted with the head of a ram, and this certainly reflects the merging of Amun with a local ram deity of the Kushites. The Egyptian empire collapsed by 1069 BCE. The succeeding centuries in Kush have often been called a dark age, But research is now making very clear that local political authority of Kushites continued and indeed grew after the Egyptian collapse. The most striking evidence of a resurgent Kush are a series of burials at a site near Jebel Barkal called El-Kurru. And this is a reconstruction of a series of burials there. You can see that the burials progress, well, I will explain to you that the burials progress from the dark toned burial mounds in the right side of the image to increasingly Egyptian forms in which there are pyramids and enclosure walls and chapels. And through this earlier part of the sequence, what's underneath those pyramids is still a very Kushite just pit in the ground, a simple pit. So this is kind of a progressive adoption. I prefer that term to traditional art historical terms like influence, because this shows that the Kushites are doing this of their own volition. It's not something that's happening to them. They're choosing to adopt these symbolic forms. Beginning in around 720 BCE, one of these kings, King Pianki, conquered Egypt, establishing, as Sarah mentioned, rule over Egypt as the 25th dynasty of Egypt. After the conquest of Egypt, Kushite adoption of aspects of elite culture increased, including particularly the first use of hieroglyphic script, as in this stela describing Pianki's conquest of Egypt. As an ironic side note, this very important monument of ancient Kushite hegemony over Egypt was removed from what's now Sudan by a British colonial official and brought to Cairo, where it now sits in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Kushites also adopted elements of Egyptian elite funerary ritual. And here you see a tomb painting from El-Kurru of the burial of Queen Kalhata. Kushite rule over Egypt ended in the 660s, but the dynasty of Napata would continue to rule Kush with some changes of location for another 1,000 years. Royal burials at this point had moved from El-Kurru to the site of Nuri near Jebel Barkal, and here you can see a line of king's pyramids there. That white splotch in the middle is an active archaeological project of my colleague Piers Paul Kriesman. Some of you may have seen film or press about scuba diving in a pyramid. There's a National Geographic documentary called Flooded Tombs of the Nile, and the water table in this region has risen since antiquity, and so in order to get down into these burial chambers, it now requires scuba gear. So anyway, that's what that light-colored intrusion is. Okay. So the next centuries, that is about 600 to 300 BCE, saw the gradual rise of Meroe over 200 kilometers to the southeast of Napata. And by 270 BCE, the location of Kushite royal burials was also moved there, which begins, as Sarah said, the Meroitic period of Kush. And here is an image of those pyramids, royal pyramids at Meroe. During these centuries, Egypt was ruled first by a dynasty descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, known as the Ptolemaic dynasty, and then by the Romans, who famously defeated the last Ptolemaic ruler Cleopatra in 31 BCE. The Ptolemies were interested in Kush as a source of war elephants, and first raided Kush and then began to acquire elephants in the 200s BCE. With the Roman conquest of Egypt, Rome came into contact with Kush. In a series of border skirmishes, as the historian Strabo tells us, the Kushite armies were led in battle by the Kushite queen who he named Kandake, although that was her title rather than her name. He also calls her a masculine sort of woman and blind in one eye. Representations of Kushite queens of this period in particular show them to be large, powerful women, as this representation of a different queen, Amanitori, shows. In the course of these conflicts, Romans claim to have come all the way to Jebel Barkal and sacked Napata, although this claim is disputed by historians. The success of the Kushite campaigns against Rome is illustrated by a pristine head of the Roman ruler Augustus that was found all the way down in Meroe. It was found actually under the threshold of this modest temple, and so the idea, of course, is that visitors going in and out of the temple would be trampling over the head of Augustus. Very satisfying. Okay. So as I mentioned, this period of Meroitic Kush is interesting for a number of reasons, but partly because of the prominence of its queens, not only in their physical strength, but in ruling as sole rulers. Several of those queens who ruled as sole rulers were buried not at Meroe, but back at Jebel Barkal in these pyramids that are illustrated here. And this bracelet that's in the Getty exhibit is from one of the tombs of these queens, presumably of a ruling queen at Jebel Barkal. Kush as an empire collapsed around 300 CE. There were multiple causes, among them the rise of Aksum in highland Ethiopia and the resulting loss of revenue from trade, which was increasingly routed through the Red Sea during this period. Two non-Kushite groups of people were also on the scene toward the end of the Meroitic period, and I've indicated them in red on the map here. The Blemis in the eastern desert and the Noba in the savanna to the southwest. The Noba are relevant to the later history of Kush because they would eventually settle in the Nile Valley, where they became known as Nubians, and would establish kingdoms that converted to Christianity and would rule the Middle Nile Valley themselves for another 1,000 years. They are mostly outside my story today, but they are certainly the ancestors of the modern Nubians who live in southern Egypt and northern Sudan today. That's a lot of history, but I wanted to make a couple of important points. First is that Kush as a political entity lasted for over 2,000 years. It had broad contacts and impacts in the ancient world, and this history is also important for understanding the local history at Jebel Barkal. Okay, part 2, archaeological excavation. And this is actually just one slide, but I'm going to talk about it for a little bit. European exploration of Kush began in the 1820s, continued off and on throughout the 19th century, with the very first excavations, archaeological excavations, being just before 1900. Particularly important of the early archaeologists was George Reisner, pictured here on the right, whose excavations provided most, if not all, of the objects featured in the Getty exhibit. You cannot overstate Reisner's contributions to the archaeology of Kush. He established the first chronology of Kush and Nubia through his survey and excavations in the early 1900s. And even though his main job was excavating at Giza in Egypt, he took his winter vacations when it was too cold in Egypt to go down to Sudan, and he systematically excavated all the royal burials at Kerma, El-Kurru, Nuri, Meroe, and Jebel Barkal over a period of little more than 10 years. He is also well known for his colonial, which is to say racist interpretations, which famously include Kerma could not have been built by local people. It must have been Egyptians who, quote, went native. Okay, even in his day, nobody believed this. And secondly, that the dynasty of Napata could not have been local. It must have been founded by North Africans, and he used the term Libyans. So everyone who talks about Kush and the history of exploration cites these interpretations. But I want to explore another aspect of Reisner's work as it affects our understanding of Kush as an ancient culture. That is, that his excavations were sponsored by the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, whose main aim was to gather material for its collections. Okay, fair enough. That's entirely typical of the way that archaeological projects were funded in those days. So Reisner, like most archaeologists of his time, focused his attention on places that would produce museum-quality objects, which means particularly temples and tombs. His own research interests were mainly in establishing a sequence of kings and ruling queens for Kush, which further biased his research toward the elite. So what I'm trying to say is he had a very particular motivation for conducting archaeological excavation, and it systematically biased the kinds of places that he dug and the kind of interpretations that he generated. I would argue that this bias set research priorities in the archaeology of Kush, and it's not just Kush, it's really in the Nile Valley and indeed in the region more broadly. And these research priorities continue in some ways today. Very few projects have focused on living contexts of ordinary people in ancient Kush. There are some exceptions, and I'm very pleased to note a couple of them. One by the Swiss archaeologist Charles Bonnet, who worked, as you saw, to produce a city plan of the ancient capital of Kerma. And my colleague Pavel Wolf has also done exemplary work on a smaller settlement near Merowe called Hamadab. So anyway, let me show you how these issues have played out in the archaeology of Jebel Barkal. So here is the Jebel itself. We've seen this image before. The Egyptians established, as I said, a fortified settlement here. Why here? There are many explanations for this. One of them has to be that there was an earlier Kushite settlement here. We found a few potsherds scattered around, but not enough to document anything systematically. Another idea is that this mountain itself had religious significance. So this is an idea that my colleague Tim Kendall has developed more than anyone else, I would say. And it focuses on that pinnacle of rock that you see at the left of the slide. So symbolically, let's just say that rock represents a uraeus. That's a protective serpent that you would see on the crowns of Egyptian kings and queens that would spit poison and fire at the enemy of the ruler. Okay, so on this interpretation, Jebel Barkal was particularly important, not only because of its, or maybe even primarily because of a strategic importance, but because of its religious significance. That is, as an emblem in the living rock of the power of kingship. So because of this symbolism, the Egyptians, as I mentioned, built a temple to the god Amun at the base of the Jebel. And there in that rectangle, you can see the Egyptian version of this temple. After the collapse of the Egyptian Empire, there was a lapse in construction at the site. But when Pianki conquered Egypt, he more than tripled the size of the Amun temple. Walking around the site today, it looks very largely ruined, and there's, particularly in that outermost court that you see to the right, it looks like just sand, but in fact that sand covers up a very significant amount of unexposed temple walls, and on those walls are reliefs depicting Pianki's conquest of Egypt. So this was part of the expansion that Pianki did in making Jebel Barkal his royal capital. He also built other temples. So this is a sort of modern topographic reconstruction of the area of the temples. You can see the Amun temple in the center and a series of other temples built all around it. Unfortunately, they are less clearly visible today. We're just starting a conservation project in the temple area that we're hoping will both protect and make them more clearly visible for visitors. Also in that mass of ruins, here it's a little clearer on a more traditional archaeological plan. At the bottom left, you see B1200 Napatan Palace. So in addition to expanding the temple to Amun, Pianki also built himself a palace. Unfortunately, Reisner was an excellent technician, an excellent excavator. His skill did not apply very well to the complexity of excavating ancient mud brick architecture, and so what our understanding of the Napatan Palace is essentially nonsensical. We're also hoping to rectify that in the coming years. Okay. So you also see, in addition to the upper right, a building that's labeled B1500. This is a Meroitic palace. It's a palace of King Na-Takamani that's being excavated, or has been excavated and conserved by an Italian team. And I'm showing two guardian lion figures that are very distinctive of the Meroitic period that were found outside one of the entrances. So, in sum, to kind of sum up what we know about the archaeology of Jebel Barkal, I've indicated with these circles places where various generations of archaeologists have located monumental buildings of the Meroitic period. And it's a little bit hard to tell because some of these buildings are enveloped by the modern town, but they're very clearly there. If you encompass all of that in a single area, it makes a city of 75 hectares, which may not mean very much to people who aren't archaeologists, but it makes it almost twice the size of ancient Meroe, the supposed capital of Kush during this period. So that is to say that Jebel Barkal, as we know, continued to grow and grow and grow throughout the history of Kush. So with that background, let me pause for a moment to highlight this issue of bias in the history of archaeology at the site and ask what's missing. We know about pyramid burials, we know about temples, we know about palaces. What's missing from our understanding of this ancient urban center of Kush? So, one thing that is just shocking as an archaeologist is that we have no idea what they ate. And this is, for archaeologists, this is one of the most basic things. When you excavate a city, you find out what people ate. You find out what's different between what rich people ate and what poor people ate. You find out maybe how culturally different groups of people butchered their food, prepared their food, cooked their food differently. There have been no excavation of those kinds of areas of a site where we might get that kind of information. We don't know what kind of plants they grew. And this is actually a particularly interesting question for Kush because Kush is located at an environmental but also a cultural boundary between the Middle Eastern crop complex of wheat and barley, very familiar to many of us here today, and further to the south is an African crop complex of sorghum and millet. Wheat and barley had been brought in from the Middle East all the way down, up the Nile. So were they growing wheat, barley, sorghum, millet? What was going on there, and how does that relate to our understanding of the cultural diversity of the population? We don't know anything about what the economy was like beyond the temples and palaces. Nothing. It's like one of the questions that comes up over and over again is, were there private merchants maybe who were part of the trade in olive oil, wine, other products that we know about up and down the Nile Valley? And we know nothing about it. Another question of maybe even greater interest today is, how did changes of climate, I already mentioned that the desert edge had moved southward through the historical period that I'm talking about, how did that changing climate and changing local environment affect the lives of the people in Jebel Barkal? None of these have been concerns of archaeologists working in this region, and these are the questions that I had in mind when Tim Kendall, my predecessor as co-director of the archaeological project at Jebel Barkal, invited me to begin work there. So the beginning of our work was that I walked around the site with a graduate student from the University of Michigan named Greg Tucker. You'll see a picture of him in a minute. And we looked for places that could be remains of the ancient town. So normally in archaeological sites in this part of the world, town sites are mounds. I don't know if any of you are aware of this kind of basic idea of archaeological stratigraphy. People build in their houses in mud brick, and then they collapse, and they build on top, and they build on top until there's a mound. That's the normal thing. There's no visible mound at Jebel Barkal, so that's part of the thing that reason that nobody's gone looking for it. There is, I've labeled an area on the site that we're calling the East Mound. It's not really a mound. It's sort of an interruption in the slope of the ground down toward the Nile. So it's not really a mound. It's just kind of a bulge, let's say. Anyway, so my colleague Greg Tucker was a specialist in geophysics, and in a few days of work with his magnetometry equipment, we got a picture of what was underneath the surface of the East Mound. Interpreting these images is not totally straightforward. I'm going to show you a bigger one in a second. But perhaps you can just see in the left part of the black and white area kind of a darker black grid structure. That's an ancient building. So in 3 days of work, we got enough information to show us that this was, in fact, this lost area of settlement that nobody had been looking for all this time. So here is Greg. This is not actually how we do magnetometry at Jebel Barkal. This wouldn't work, but he's got some spirit. Anyway, so in 2018, Greg was able to do a magnetometry survey of the entire area, and I think on this bigger image you can more clearly see that there are multiple areas of buildings of different sizes, different shapes, and that there's a density and a diversity of architecture that we would call truly urban. So we began our excavations in the center of this image with this very clearly demarcated structure. And I'll show you what that looks like here. This was after our first, we've had 3 small seasons of excavation. We missed one because of the pandemic. But here you see us just opening trenches on the surface of the mound. You can see that the architecture is right under the surface. There's a little covering of sand, but when you go down, you get right into mud brick architecture. And here is that same area at the end of our 2022 season. Lots and lots of walls that maybe only an archaeologist could love, but I'll give you here's an interpreted drawing that gives you some idea. And the point is, as an urban center, it really is partly about the diversity of structures. And what we see is, for example, on the lower right, a small house, actually a couple of small houses. In the middle, we see a larger, sort of more institutional building. This is actually a platform for a building that has disappeared, and what we have is the foundations of the platform. And at the top, we have a network of small spaces with cooking pots left in place, very clearly relating to occupation. Excuse me. Okay, so what did we find in these excavations? Well, we found all kinds of pottery of the early Meroitic period. You can see examples of painted jars on the slide to the right. We also found a variety of earlier sherds, so this is what's suggesting to us that we have a whole stratified site there. The earlier levels just remain to be excavated. We found imports from the Mediterranean. Terra sigillata is a distinctive kind of pottery of the Roman Empire. Trade sherds from Cyprus. And indeed, in our wider excavations, we found amphorae, these large trade vessels that came from as far away as the Italian peninsula. So very clearly, Jebel Barkal was connected to this larger system. We also found, next to that monumental building, not the gold ring, I can't claim the gold ring, but we found a lot of lumps of clay that had impressions of gold rings on them. And so we found a hoard of about 3,000 lumps of clay, and you can just maybe make out the kind of the impressions of a signet ring in them. And here's none of them is very clear, but this is the impression of one ring that maybe you can make out. This is a kind of a Rorschach test for you. Maybe you can make out a kneeling ram whose face is pointing to the right with a crown extending above its head. In any case, what's interesting about these lumps of clay is that they're administrative devices. So important officials would have seal rings. They would seal jars or other kinds of containers of goods, and they would be sealed under their authority. Then they might be moved around the city, and by tracking the location of seals of particular seal rings, we can begin to get a sense of how the different parts of the city were connected. And so part of this analysis is going to be connecting to the Natakamani Palace, where a similar cache of seal impressions was found. We also found a number of faience molds. Sarah, in her introduction, talked about faience as a kind of a glazed ceramic material. And while these were not in their original context, it makes it very clear that faience manufacture was one of the things that was going on in this area of the site, and we're hoping to be able to document that further. So I didn't mention this. Jebel Barkal is a UNESCO World Heritage Site for its historical importance. And for that reason, we are sometimes under specific directives from UNESCO. Last season, we did not have permission to excavate beneath the ground. We only had permission to do surface clearance. Fine, so you can do a lot of surface clearance on a site like this. And we decided to take this opportunity to trace what we thought on the magnetometry plan looked like streets. So that's one of the interesting questions about cities, is how they're laid out, how different parts of the city are connected. And you can perhaps just make out here, if you follow that line of bricks all the way toward the horizon, that's a 60-meter long stretch of ancient street. So here's the street. Here's a cross street here with a building here and a building here. There's a little jog in the street. The street continues down this way, and it continues going further to the north. So if you zoom out a little bit, there is our excavation on the right. And that cross street heads directly to the Natakamani Palace. So this is beginning to put together these separate elements of excavation into something that's a little more comprehensible. It's more comprehensible as a connected urban center. So we've also done the first analysis of animal bones found at the site. These are samples from that same area where we found all the seal impressions, and we found a remarkable concentration of cattle bones. You remember at the beginning of the lecture I talked about how Kush was a cattle culture. And so this is economically important, but also symbolically important. 85% of the bones found in that area were of cattle. So they were only serving steak at that particular institutional building. We also did, and anyway, so this is one of the things when you start to look around the city, you would expect that there will be some places where you have a very high concentrations of cattle bones, of high status food, and you would find other areas of the site where you either have culturally different food or you have lower status food. And that's one very good way to start mapping out the kind of social geography of the city's population. What's missing from our assemblage? Fish. It's right on the Nile, right? It's interesting that there's no fish. And there seems to be some idea in ancient Kush that eating fish was not something that the elite did, certainly. There was some stigma about eating fish, and we don't really fully understand it, but we're hoping to be looking for it in other areas of the site. We also have done the first look at ancient botanical remains, ancient plant remains at the site. And I don't expect any of you to recognize any of these particular seeds, photographs of them taken through the microscope. But anyway, I'll just tell you, almost all of the plant remains are of wheat and barley rather than of sorghum and millet. So you know, again, we'll want to be comparing this to different areas of the site to see if this is locally significant or whether it applies to the entire settlement. So this is my last archaeological slide, and then I want to talk a very little bit about collaboration. One of the things that struck me about the ancient city was that it's a long way from the river. It's over a mile away from the river, and when you have to go and carry your water in buckets, you would not have done that in antiquity. So I sort of thought that maybe the landscape had changed in antiquity, and that in antiquity there had been a channel of the Nile closer to the site. So one way you can test that is by drilling deep boreholes into the ground and looking for evidence of kind of alluvial sediments, river-borne sediments. And so we did this last year, and you can see in the slide that the yellow pins in the red circle, those all show evidence that there was a river channel running right next to the site. So this is really exciting. We don't yet know the date of this river channel. I mean, it's clearly not later than the buildings because it doesn't, wash away big portions of the Amun temple. However, it seems that the buildings are built up next to it, and we don't have any buildings built over what we know of the channel so far. So anyway, we're going to be investigating this further in the season to come. And I have to say, as an archaeologist, I've had a lot of theories in my day, a lot of theories. They're almost never right. So this one was extremely gratifying. I had an idea, we tested it, and it was right. When does that ever happen? Okay, so as I said at the beginning of the talk, we are deeply committed to making this project a collaborative project, a fully collaborative project. And to put this in an academic language, we want to decolonize the way that we do archaeology in the field. And we've been working on this slowly over the last 7 years. I mean, honestly, this is not how I set out to do my field work. But it was partly as a result of the extremely warm welcome that we had from people in El-Kurru village, where we started our work in the area of Napata. And here's this meeting was actually the beginning of the whole thing, where we gave a presentation to the men who had been digging with us about our own research questions, and then just asked them simply enough, what questions did they have about what we were doing, and what could the ancient site mean to them? And just to give you an example of how different those questions can be. So I was looking for an ancient city. We had reasons to think that there was an ancient city next to the royal cemetery at El-Kurru. Complete failure. That's more normal in archaeology. Complete failure. We didn't find any, we found lots of other things, but we didn't find the city that we were looking for. So after we had finished talking to them about that, they wanted to ask us, just to cut to the question that was most different from our own research questions, they wanted to ask us if we thought that the ancient Kushites were darker in skin tone than them or lighter. Okay, that is a question that I had not come to the field expecting to address. And in fact, it's not one that I could address with any of the evidence at my disposal. But what it showed me was that as an archaeologist, I'm coming from a research tradition that has its own questions associated with it. They're coming at this material with their own heritage traditions, in which they think of themselves as descended from people in Arabia, rather than from the ancient cultures of Sudan. This is the people we're working among are called the Shaigia. They're Muslim, and they wish to emphasize the Arab part of their ancestry. And so their own theory about this, in order to conform with that vision of their history, was that they were lighter in skin tone than the ancient Kushites because many of them had come from Arabia. I don't know about that. But anyway, so that began a whole series of conversations. And just to jump to where we are today with that, we've decided to launch a community heritage center that is going to be locally curated. And I'm showing you here the end of this last season. We're renovating a house in the village that'll be the location of this community heritage center. It's not a visitor center, because that would only be for visitors to the site. It's a community heritage center because it's for use both by visitors and by the community. One of the issues that we collectively chose to address in this center, which is really about representation of history and culture. One of the questions was, can we do anything to overcome the divide between archaeology and contemporary life? So as an archaeological tourist, people come to the site, they visit the pyramids, and they leave without ever engaging with, interacting with, or in many cases even thinking about who the local people living right next to the site are. So one of our contributions to addressing or trying to overcome that gap is that this Heritage Center will have a representation of local traditions done by people in the village themselves. They've taken photographs, they've written descriptions of how their photographs are meaningful, and we're arranging them so that people who come to the site will learn about the site, but will also learn something about Shaigia life. This guy right here is named Anwar Mahjoub, and he has become the curator, the local curator of the Heritage Center. He's a young fellow. He grew up in the village. He went to college. He taught himself English to a remarkably high level. And in fact, it's his family's house that we're renovating for the Heritage Center. And this photograph is from last season. It depicts, his father was a woodworker. And so he's written in the Heritage Center about the things that his father made as a woodworker. This photo shows a moment when, in the renovation of the house, we found one of his father's woodworking chisels. It was a kind of a sweet moment. This has been, I have to say, just a transformational experience for those of us professional archaeologists who are foreign to Sudan. And so we're trying to bring some similar kinds of ideas to our work at Jebel Barkal as the team transitions down the road. And we've begun a community engagement project that's jointly led by a Sudanese man, Tahami Abul Ghasim, back left there, and by Rebecca Bradshaw. This is one of the ways that we're trying to build collaboration into our professional work, is by having positions jointly held by a Sudanese and by a foreign scholar. We're just beginning this, and I don't have so many results to present yet, but it's very exciting to all of us. So I would like to invite any of you who are interested in learning more about our work to go to our archaeological website about Jebel Barkal, listed there at the top. I'm also part of a collaborative work on collaborative project called Narrating Nubia, the Social Lives of Heritage, that's based at the University of Michigan, that's looking at the significance of Nubia, ancient and modern, in both Egypt and Sudan today. And there's my email there if you would like to contact me directly. And with that, I'll call it a day. Thank you all for your attention. And we have a certain amount of time for questions. I think we will be going back and forth between questions from those of you who are here and people who may be online. I sort of suspect that my mother and my wife, at least, are online. That's what I'm led to understand. But anyway, questions, welcome. Anyone?
Yes, we do have some Zoom questions coming in. I don't think any are from your wife or mother, but
okay.
We'll
okay.
keep an eye out. There are microphones in the audience,
yes.
So if you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to come to you.
So we have one right here in the audience, and then we'll go to a Zoom question.
Thank you for an excellent lecture. I have a landscape question for you about the relationship between the overhead topical map that you showed of Jebel Barkal. Looked very similar to the Kern mountain in Luxor, and the distance from the Nile and the presence of temples all around the mountain in Luxor looks very similar to Jebel Barkal, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are about their relationship, if you have any.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, so one of the, as you very well know, so Iman is coming to work on my project as part of a regional survey this season. As you very well know, part of the interpretive challenge of the last few decades has been trying to start in our interpretations with Kush rather than with Egypt. And I begin there. And I mean, I guess I would say that I can't really think of a reason why that site in Egypt near Thebes would have served as a symbolic basis for all of the growth of the city around Jebel Barkal. I mean, there's certainly when the Egyptians built their temple, that I could see that kind of connection being present in the New Kingdom. But most of the construction that we saw there is Napatan or later. It's an interesting question. I'll think about it more. I'm not immediately seeing the connections that maybe you are. Would you like to follow up with some?
I'm less talking about as a human-centric question and more of a landscape-centric question.
Right.
And not necessarily inferring that one influences the other, but that there is a tradition that in the entirety of the region, that, as you said, like in the beginning, that the god might be in the rock.
Yeah.
And that in the, I guess, Egyptian aspect, that the severed limbs of Osiris are scattered right throughout, and then one of them is in the mountain in the Kern, and then the Amun in Barkal, and just the similarity. I can't, as a landscape archaeologist, I can't not see the relationship. So I'm wondering what you think about that relationship, less so from a human empire perspective, but more so as a cognitive relationship with landscape.
Sure. Sort of sacred landscape, and well, it's true that my own interest is in the human geography more than in the sacred geography, and part of the, for me, part of it is trying to find a balance between those things. So for me, I'm reluctant to go all the way to saying that really what determines the growth of these settlements is purely a priestly idea, basically, because anyway, it's a very interesting idea. Osiris is definitely there, as we know, and so thinking about how his parts could be related to Jebel Barkal, that's an interesting question. Thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, so we have some questions coming in on Zoom, one of which has to do with the motivations behind the shifting of these centers or capital cities further south over time. And does that have anything to do with the issue of climate change that you brought up? Or what is motivating them to move from Kerma further south to Napata and then eventually to Merowe?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's definitely, when you look at this time scale, it's very clear that there's a southern movement. At the moment, we don't have enough climate information to really make that judgment in any kind of a fine-grained way. In the broad brush sense, it's plausible but not yet demonstrated. The traditional explanation of it has to do more with getting away from Egyptian power. That's one idea, because there are repeated Egyptian raids down into Kush. And then another explanation that I think is also quite possible. Well, we know that within Kush itself was not a monolith. Within the different branches of the royal family, there were factions, people were fighting with each other, and we also think that there were different cultural groups, one of them based at Merowe that had perhaps different cultural practices, one of them based at Napata, perhaps one of them based at Kerma. So you could also explain this as being due to internal political conflict, and that the southward movement, it's just the way the dice happen to fall. So anyway, the climate piece of it is something that we're definitely working on at Barkal and looking forward to being able to address. Thank you. Take a question from the audience. We've got two here. I'm sorry, wait, can you wait for the microphone? Hi.
Hi. I have a question in regards to this presentation and archaeology.
Yes.
Do you ever reference some of the biblical stories that are in the Old Testament? Because a lot of this is some of this is in the Old Testament, so I want to know from archaeologists' point of view, do you ever reference some of the stories that are in the Bible in order to do some of your research?
Yeah. Well, the role of the Bible in archaeological research is something that people take a lot of different perspectives on. So there's a way of treating the Bible as a historical text, and that's sort of where I am. Just as I don't really start with Osiris, I also don't start with the Bible. But you're absolutely right that historically, for example, I didn't mention him by name, but Taharko is one of the most powerful Napatan kings, and he does appear in the Bible under the name of Tirhaka when he was actively defending Jerusalem against the invasion of the Assyrian army. That's one of the many. One of Moses' wives is said to be Cushite, for example. You can go on and on and on. And for me, as a secular historian, and that's what I am in this role. I'm interested in those references for the intercultural context that they document, and it very definitely shows, like many of these other historical records, that Cush did have this impact on the history of the Middle East. And I have to say, I also don't want to privilege the Middle East as a location where history mattered. It's just much more difficult in this current state of our knowledge to know how Cush affected inner Africa to the south or to the west of the Nile Valley. Where there are projects that are working in those areas, and we'll hope to know more about those directions too. But so that's a partial answer. I think there are scholars who are more biblically oriented archaeologists, but they're mostly working in Israel and Palestine, and not so much in Sudan. Thank you. Do we have another Zoom one?
Yes. So someone is wondering if you can speak more about the challenges of excavating a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and how is that different from maybe your archaeological work in other areas? And then what happens to everything that is uncovered in your excavations?
Yeah, so UNESCO World Heritage designation really changes a lot of things for a project like ours. It imposes high standards for conservation, and over the now more than 100-year history of excavation at the site, there's been relatively little attention to conservation. So UNESCO has been pretty appropriately ferocious in asserting the need to start taking care of the site. And so I completely support that. But it does mean that a significant amount of our project's attention goes toward things like developing a management plan for the time when there's more tourism coming to the site. So I think all of that is to the good. Archaeologists, if left to themselves, will just keep digging and digging and digging and digging, and won't care so much about what sort of a state they leave the site in. And so UNESCO helps us with that. That was one of the questions. The other what happens to the stuff? Yeah.
On the site, what happens?
Yeah. So just about everywhere you dig in the world these days, the stuff stays in the country. That's the antiquities law in Sudan. Sudan is actually quite generous in terms of allowing us to bring material out of the country for study. And so we do bring material out for dating analysis and that kind of thing. But basically everything stays in the country, stays in the local museum, and if we find things of higher, that are more at risk of theft, they would probably go down to the National Museum in Khartoum. But we do have a local site museum, and things can get checked in there. I think I saw another question in the...
Yeah,
hi.
Thank you, Professor, for a fascinating and well-illustrated talk. I was struck looking at the exhibit by the names of the kings and the queens, and of course the beautiful names of the cities and the sites, and the word Meroe, sounds like a Greek or a Hellenized version of a local name. So what do we know about the Kushite language, if anything, and did they speak Egyptian? Were they bilingual? Do we know anything? Do we know anything about writing systems?
We do. That's a good question. It wasn't. I didn't talk about that. I mean, I'm teaching a semester-long class on Nubia right now, so there's obviously a huge amount more to say. But that's a great question. So until that stela of Pianki that I showed you, maybe a little bit before, Kushites didn't write anything. So we don't have any earlier writing. Their earliest writing is done in Egyptian hieroglyphs in the Egyptian language. So you have to distinguish between the script and the language sometimes. So so there's a period of time when we can read, these inscriptions until, let's say, a little after 300 BCE. So at that point, they develop their own writing system that we call Meroitic script. It's based on a limited number of Egyptian signs, okay? And it's basically an alphabet, but using Egyptian signs as the letters. However, they also switched from writing in the Egyptian language to writing in their own language, which is called Meroitic, or we call it Meroitic. And that language we don't understand. So reading those texts is, you go along, you can sound out everything, or the people who know the script can do that. Sound out everything, and you'll go along, blah, 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 amun, blah, 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 napata, blah, 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 but we don't understand any of the nouns, verbs, or adjectives. So like, we do understand a few of them. Anyway, so what we would need to decipher the language, the script we understand, it's the language is the problem, is a bilingual inscription. So if we have a similar text in two different languages and we know one of the languages, then we get a whole bunch of vocabulary from making that translation. And we haven't found it. That's the Rosetta Stone. If I were going to name a place that was likely to have a bilingual inscription, Jebel Barkal would be very close to the top of the list. So we'll keep digging. It's a complicated question. And did they speak Egyptian? Yeah, that's a hard question to answer. Exactly who? I mean, clearly, when the Kushites conquered Egypt, they clearly brought a bunch of scribes and artisans back down to Kush, but the extent of kind of Egyptian communication, I can't even think of a way to address that satisfactorily. Thank you.
There's a question about this possible channel of the Nile that you discussed, and whether you think that would have been a natural or man-made feature.
Yeah. So the Nile, I would assume it would have been a natural feature. We know in other stretches of the Nile that the Nile channel that's now a single channel was braided in antiquity. And so again, this could potentially relate to climate change. It could also just relate to the natural kind of course of development of rivers, but natural probably rather than man-made. We don't know that for sure. I mean, one of the here I can advance this back a little bit. One of the tantalizing things about this is that this channel location is very close to the entrance to the temple. And we know that boat processions of statues of gods were a common feature both in Egypt and in Kush. And so it raises the possibility that there was other kinds of regular transport, economic transport that involved docking right there. And so one of the things we're hoping to look at in the coming season is the possibility of harbor features or something like that, close to the site. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the really interesting talk. I had a question about some of the earlier pottery sherds you're finding. I was wondering if they're all localized to the same area, and exactly what phase of the early pottery are you finding?
You're asking about Napatan pottery?
Yeah.
Yeah, not Kerma pottery.
Yeah.
Well, so one of the challenges for us in dating things is that there isn't this history of stratigraphic excavation where you can really clearly date all the different pottery forms. So right now, the pottery forms that are the most precisely dated are the imports. like that Cypriot jug that I showed. That could be 6th century. We don't really have anything yet that is definitively earlier than that, but it has to be there somewhere. It has to be there somewhere. We just haven't got to those levels yet. So stay tuned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's a Zoom question about the seal impressions that you discovered, the hoard of, I think you said 3,000 impressions. And does it seem that the impressions are being made locally by, local people with their signet rings, or are there, for instance, any impressions of cylinder seals or any with iconography that could indicate that they were imported from elsewhere?
Yeah, basically there's no, so this technology of sealing mud with signet rings is a new innovation in the Meroitic period. None of our seal impressions show cylinder seal impressions. They're all stamped from a ring. But whether they could be sort of regional exchange rather than just exchange within the city, it's difficult for us to know yet. Like, one thing we would want to do is find or have someone find a similar hoard at Meroe, and then we could begin possibly to compare the specific impressions. There has also recently, a Polish team recently found a similar cache about 100 kilometers downstream at another Meroitic site. So, we're getting to the point where we can start to assemble a regional picture, but nobody's done that research yet. So it's a great opportunity for a PhD dissertation for some promising young student out there.
Well, that does relate to another question that came in about whether you might say a little bit about the settlement archaeology that's been done in the region of Meroe, and how does it compare to what you're discovering at Jebel Barkal?
Yeah, it is. So I highlighted one urban excavation at the site of Hamadab. But it is true that urban archaeology is a coming thing, particularly in the region of Meroe. So there are a number of projects that are beginning to do this work. Hamadab is the furthest along, and I guess I'm just excited to see how this is going to develop. It's challenging. It's technically challenging to do this work well. So part of the issue is that the skill to excavate mud bricks that are surrounded by mud, that's not totally simple. So, and we need to develop a lot of people who can successfully disarticulate them and understand the construction sequences. But it's coming.
I think we have time for one more question. Are there any from the in-person audience? No? Okay. We'll conclude with one from Zoom then, which relates a bit to what you were just saying. There are some questions about whether the rising of the water table has to do with the construction of the Aswan High Dam, or is this climate change with regard to the tomb chambers that are now filled with water, and also what you were discussing, the challenges of excavating in this region?
Yeah, I might have to punt this one. I can say a couple of things about it. It's definitely not related to the Aswan Dam, because that's let's say 1,000 kilometers downstream. So that's not what's affecting the groundwater at Nuri. There is a dam just upstream that was completed in 2008 called the Meroe Dam. Confusingly, there's too many Meroes. Anyway, and there's been some thought that was contributing to the rise in water table at Nuri, but there have also been suggestions that, in fact, this was a feature of the site from antiquity, and that it just has to do with more about groundwater than I actually know, the aquifers and whatever. And I know that our Sudanese colleagues have done a study of this, and so I don't want to say anything, because I know that there are people who know more about this than I do.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Dr. Emberling for his excellent talk.